What if your personality isn't as fixed as you think? What if you could intentionally adjust what you think, feel, do, and desire to unlock more meaning and protect yourself from burnout? This is Andrew Soren, and today on Meaningful Work Matters, we're diving deep into personality dynamics, how you express, regulate, and restore aspects of yourself to meet your most meaningful goals. I'm sitting down with Dr. Reb Rebele, an academic and expert in personality psychology and organizational behavior, who also happens to be one of my best friends. Reb shares how understanding the ways personality works can help you become the right version of yourself at the right time, whether at work, at home, or in pursuit of just about any meaningful experience. Plus, true to character, you'll hear Reb challenge some common preconceptions we have, like why being authentically true to yourself isn't necessarily about showing up the same way all the time. This is another two-parter on Meaningful Work Matters, so make sure that you stay tuned for part 2 when we'll tackle the dark sides of collaboration and generosity and how to avoid burnout while still making a difference. Oh, and before we dive in, I have some exciting news. After countless conversations with listeners like you about making work more meaningful, we're launching something new. If you've ever wished you could discuss these ideas with other thoughtful professionals and figure out how to put them into practice, well, I've got something special for you. We're piloting a pod club. Think about it as a book club, but for our podcast community. Our first session is coming up on Wednesday, February the 26th, and I'd love to see you there. Head to eubd.ca/podclub to learn more. Now, let's get into today's conversation. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Reb Rebele, it is about time that you showed up on the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. It's an absolute delight and honor to be here.
So, Reb, you and I have known each other for at least 12 years now, maybe even 13. Is it 13 years now? It's been a long time. You were an assistant instructor when I went through the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program at the University of Pennsylvania, and then basically became my best friend. So,
it's been a delightful journey together.
And it just so happens that you are a bit of, a subject matter expert in the topic that this podcast is about. Maybe not necessarily meaningful work, but maybe a lot of things that are tangential to meaningful work. And I'm really excited to dive into a whole whack of things in probably a number of different directions today. So,
yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, you mentioned that I was an assistant instructor. Well, the student has truly become the master in this case. There's nobody who knows more about this topic than you. So I want to ask you some questions back as we go along the way.
I definitely am not going to allow for that statement to be true, but you can ask me any questions, and I encourage you to. But before you do, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what makes your work meaningful?
Sure. So I live in Melbourne, Australia. I'm an academic who teaches MBA students management and leadership subjects. I do research on a wide range of topics, as we'll talk about today: personality psychology, positive psych, organizational behavior. I'm just generally interested in lots of different things. And they say personality psychology is the last home of the generalist in psychology. So I think that really suits me very well. I'm also a dad and have a great family here. So what makes my work meaningful? I think, the obvious answer is the opportunity to make an impact, right? So when I get the chance to teach people things that they can use that sort of help them understand their experiences and improve their work and their lives going forward, that's certainly the ultimate end that I'm aiming for. But I also really like Anne Lamott, one of my favorite writers, was asked, why she writes. And she basically said, well, there are two answers: because I like it and I'm good at it. And I like my work. There's a lot of intrinsic motivation in it too. It's just intellectually interesting and fun. And I can't believe people pay me to spend my time this way. And I think there are things that I'm good at in it. So it gives me a sense of mastery, right? And competence at times. Lots of room to improve, to be clear. But yeah, I think that's where my meaning at work comes from.
Amazing. Well, I want to jump right into this whole world of personality psychology because, frankly, I don't know all that much about it. I especially don't know very much about personality dynamics, which is something that you have become quite an expert in. So, can you tell us a little bit about what personality dynamics means?
Sure. So actually, let me zoom out first and talk about what personality is, right? Because I
Yeah.
think we have a lay understanding of personality, very heavily informed by things like the Myers-Briggs and just general popular notions of what it means to be an extrovert or an introvert. So when we think about personality, we tend to sort of look for two criteria. The things that we lump under the banner of personality are things that are somewhat continuous over time, right? So we expect them to, parts of a person's personality are things that we expect them to carry across a wide range of different situations, to show up in how they act and experience different situations with some degree of consistency. Not necessarily all the time, and we'll get to that in a moment, but also there are things that differ between people. So the core of personality psych is about the study of individual differences. So how can we identify differences in people's enduring patterns of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and desires, right? So that's
Hmm.
Bill Rivell and Josh Wiltz anchoring sort of the ABCDs of personality are patterns of affect, behavior, cognition, and desire. So that's what personality broadly is about, these sort of enduring things that differ between people. Personality dynamics is really the study of change and fluctuation within those patterns. So when you're interested in the dynamics of personality, what you're interested in are, in what ways do people change over longer periods of time? So things like personality development and potentially intentional personality change, but also more minute day-to-day fluctuations in how people express their personality. And that's what I'm most interested in, is the ways that each of us have all of these layers within us. The opening of my dissertation was the Walt Whitman quote about how he contradicts himself very well, then he contradicts himself. He's large, he contains multitudes. And that's what my dissertation research was about. It's about the fact that when it comes to personality expression, everybody that we studied wanted to express a wide range of personality characteristics at different times. So the punchline was nobody really wants to be just one kind of person. We might have core aspects of our personality that are central to who we are that sort of persist over time, but nobody also wants to get boxed in. And sometimes these things can be, these different parts of ourselves can feel like they're in tension, or they can feel like contradictions within us. And I'm interested in, how do people navigate that? And to what extent are they trying to be agentic about expressing and bringing out these different sides of themselves at different times?
Okay, so I have all of these different pieces within me, and the curious is what makes those things different than other people, and how do I have a sense of agency or choice in how those things come out in the wide world?
Yeah. So how would you describe your own personality, Andrew?
Oh, God, you're going to ask me questions. How would I describe? I don't even know how to start answering that question, Reb. Give me like a deeper, give me like a help text question.
Well, ignore the psychology concepts that are bringing to mind, right?
Yeah.
So if you were to describe what you were like, or maybe you might find it easier to answer this question by thinking about how you think other people would describe you. So if you ask somebody who knows you well, and we won't ask me, but somebody else who knows you well, how would they describe you? What's Andrew like? What are the
Mm.
some of the words that you think would come to mind?
Well, I just happened to be at a party tonight, and the guy that I was talking to remembered me from university. And he was like, the first time I met you, I remember you because you were wearing robes at the university that I went to. We would have these formal dinners and we'd wear these robes, and my robes had sleeves, and sleeves represented the fact that I had a scholarship. So he was like, I remember you being really smart. So that's what at least somebody said about me today. So maybe I might be smart. Maybe other people would think that I'm kind. Maybe some people would say that I'm humble, even though I don't necessarily think that I'm all that humble. As I start going through this list, I start to think about character strengths. Am I allowed to say some of those things?
Sure.
Okay. I would say that I have like a keen sense of social intelligence. There's probably a fair bit of zest in me. My top character strength is appreciation of beauty and excellence. So, I think a big part of me is my capacity to like recognize things that are amazing and excellent. So like what I often do in this podcast, people might be listening and like I love being able to notice, oh, this is what makes Reb excellent, or this is what, is really beautiful about an idea. And I like noticing that and commenting on it. Those are some things.
Yeah, what a great list. High inter-rater reliability. I would say a lot of things about you too. I think one point I want to highlight. So you mentioned character strengths. Like, can you mention those as part of personality? They're not often described as in personality terms when we sort of first encounter the idea of character strengths in positive psychology, but they are assessed and conceptualized exactly the same way as other kinds of personality traits. We might think of them as a little bit more skill based than conventional personality traits that we think of, like extroversion, introversion, or agreeableness.
Hmm?
But even those traits have some skill based components, some sort of behavioral or dispositional components that are just sort of tendencies in how you behave. So I think character strengths, absolutely, to my mind, are part of somebody's personality. Now, I think the dynamics piece of this is okay, well, you described a broad range of characteristics of what you're like. The question is, are you like all of those things all of the time? Yeah, you're shaking your
No.
head. And so then we can ask, okay, well, what are the things that bring out these different aspects of you? So we've got a lot of research, a lot of it led originally by Will Fleeson, that shows that personality expression really varies considerably moment to moment. So if you take the big five traits of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness, we could give people a survey that would assess what are your general tendencies on each of these traits. And those surveys are really predictive of a wide range of life outcomes and work experiences and things like that. But then we could also ask people to not just take one survey one time and describe what they're like in general, but we could annoy the heck out of them and ask them to do short surveys every couple of hours to say, what are you being like right now? Right? How extroverted are you being right now? How agreeable are you being right now? How conscientious are you being right now? And we know that when we do that, when we do experience sampling, people's self-reported personality expression varies a lot, such that even the most introverted person will have times over the course of 2 weeks where they're acting fairly extroverted. And even the most extroverted person will have times where they're acting fairly introverted. So that's just self-reported behavior. Their average behavior corresponds with what they say they're like in general, right? So when we describe our personality in general terms, we're often talking about our average or typical behavior. But there are all these individual instances where we might be acting out of character, so to speak. So what causes that, right? And the default explanation for a lot of people is that it's the situation, right? So changes in our environment, changes in what's happening around us, that absolutely plays a role, right? So it's kind of hard to be extroverted if you're by yourself, for example. It's kind of hard to be agreeable if you're by yourself. It's harder to be conscientious when you're with others sometimes, depending on a range of other factors. So situations play a role. But what I've looked at is to what extent do our motives or goals influence our personality expression? So
Hmm.
when we want to connect with other people, one of the things I found is we want to generally act more extroverted. So you could think about a time where you've been around other people. The situation is social in the sense that other people are around you. But if you don't want to connect with them, right? Say you're riding public transport, then you're probably not going to dial up your extroversion. I know a lot of people who actually dial down their extroversion and
Hmm.
act quite introverted when they're on public transport because they don't want to spark, a conversation with some random people. Other times people want to open themselves up to that. And so I think that's sort of what I'm really interested in is how do we try to regulate which sides of ourselves we're bringing out in any moment in order to achieve the range of different goals that we have, right? Because one moment our priority might be pleasure, one moment it might be achievement or productivity. And one of the things I've looked at is, sometimes our goal in the moment is to do something meaningful. And so you could ask, well, what size of your personality might you bring out when that's your goal? So actually, I'm going to turn it back to you. which Andrew do you try to bring out when you're really meaning motivated?
Definitely when I'm meaning motivated. I mean, if I start with just kind of those big five personality traits, uh, openness to experience is massive for me and kind of what meaning is. And I'm definitely not always open to experience, but in the context of searching out meaningful experiences, I often am looking for something new, which would kind of connect to things like character strengths of love of learning and curiosity and kind of things like that. Also, for me, meaning is often tied to other people. So there's kind of a connection to extroversion there, but also kind of social intelligence and just I think that connects to that sense of awe that I was talking about before, which is again very much anchored into what makes things meaningful me for me is often associated with awe of other people. It is virtue really and kind of a curiosity and discovery of virtue or ethics of moral exemplars. Those are things that just kind of like immediately spark for me and make something extremely meaningful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny, I'm thinking about the ways that I'm similar but different in some ways. I think for me, when I'm meaning motivated in the sense that like I feel like I need to do something meaningful, like I'm feeling a lack of meaning or, an absence of that or a longing to do something meaningful, I gravitate toward introspective experiences, right? So it's like I want to go to the art museum by myself, or I want to go read a good book, or so there's definitely an arts openness component. I generally want to go more introverted. But what's interesting, and I hadn't really thought about it until this moment, is in retrospect, I often find lots of highly extroverted social experiences very meaningful, even though they're not necessarily what I seek out. So there's like the wanting liking system distinction, right? So the things that I want when I want meaning, right, are generally on that more introverted, high openness to experience, but in sort of an intellectual aesthetic kind of way. And so
Mhm.
that's how I often seek meaning. Or it's through pro-social impact, right? So I look for an opportunity to help somebody. But there are lots of experiences that I like in a meaningfulness sense that are defined by other personality characteristics, even though I don't necessarily seek them out for that reason. And in my data, I've seen some of these trends. So on average, when people they have high eudaimonic motivation, they generally want to bring out a bit more openness, a bit more conscientiousness. Working hard at something is generally something that people associate with, pursuing meaning. But I think there is sometimes this gap of the things that we think will lead to meaning don't always do so. And the things that we think won't necessarily be as meaningful actually turn out to be so. And there'll be lots of individual differences within that. So those are the broad trends and they sort of match kind of yours and my experience. But other people who are listening, for them, it might be that they really do lean into the extroversion side of things, or for them, it's about, really wanting to go into the openness to experience in the sense of going somewhere new and stimulating. Maybe for them, that's what they do for meaning rather than going somewhere quiet and contemplative.
Hmm.
And we really have great ways of teasing that out just yet.
So I want to try to make this practical from a meaningful work perspective for people too. So I'm assuming that like the starting point is self-awareness, like what pieces of your personality are important to you might be a place to start.
Self-awareness is an interesting one. So part of the processes that I'm talking about here, right? This sort of I refer to them as trait regulation, right? So how do we regulate the expression of our personality traits? I think occasionally this happens explicitly, right? So you've got a high stake situation, work example, classic one, going in for an interview, right? So if you're going in for an interview for a job or you're going in for a sales conversation with, you're pitching somebody on an idea or a project or selling your services, often people will think strategically about how to be successful in that moment. And they might not necessarily think explicitly in terms of, oh, I want to be extroverted, or, they won't necessarily use those personality terms. Although I think when they know them, this is where the self-awareness and just building some knowledge base can be helpful, right? To say, what's a language that might describe the different ways that I want to be like in this situation? And how do I pick and choose? And then ask the question, well, what are the things that would help bring out those sides of me. I'll give you an example of mine in a moment. But I think the other issue is that most of this processing, I think, is often happening much more implicitly, right? So it's just happening in the background. We're not necessarily consciously thinking about what side of myself do I want to bring out right now. I think we tend to do it explicitly and consciously when the stakes are a little bit higher, and also when we have a bit more time to plan. So to make it super concrete, I teach, right? And when I teach, I generally like to be extroverted, right? To try to get the energy up and the engagement in the room. I would say I'm very much in ambivert territory in terms of my typical personality. So I have times where I am quite extroverted, but my default state is probably more on the introverted side of things, right? If you just look at overall frequency of what's Reb like from moment to moment, you'd see more introverted moments in my behavior and experience. And that's a good thing for me. I think generally speaking, like as my default typical behavior, introverted is, it suits me. But I love teaching, right? And I love getting up and doing a presentation that will engage people and that kind of stuff. It just takes a bit more effort for me, right? I need to think about how do I bring out the extroverted side of me
Hmm.
when I'm going in to teach. And so then I think about, okay, well, what are the triggers for me? What are the kinds of things that help me act in a more extroverted way that is sincere, right? It's we should come back to the sincerity question in a second, but that is it's sincere, it's genuine, it doesn't feel inauthentic, but it does take some effort. So it's effortful, but still authentic and sincere. What are the kinds of things that tend to bring out that side of me? Well, being well rested, right? Having exercise. So I exercised this morning before coming on this podcast because I was like, I want to be bringing some energy to my conversation with Andrew. I do the same thing when I teach. I think about how do I make sure that I've gotten good sleep, good exercise. I think about my caffeine intake, things like that. Because when I don't do those things, I know it tends to make me more neurotic. And when I'm more
Mhm.
neurotic, I'm less extroverted. I tend to withdraw a little bit. So I think strategically about energy management. I also think a bit about how do social interactions bring out an extroverted side of me. So when I am lucky enough to have a teaching assistant for my classes, I have selected a teaching assistant who is really warm and affable and trustworthy. So Rachel is a woman I've worked with a bunch, and she going in and seeing her face in the room just gives me that opening to then be more extroverted with my students. And there's other little things that I do too, right? So I think about various other factors, but it's all a sort of quest to say, how do I maximize the odds that extroverted Reb is going to come out at 6 p.m. on Wednesday night when it's time to teach, right? Because I know extroverted Reb can come out. If I leave it up to chance, it's kind of like 50-50, right? Whether it's going to happen or not. So if I do these little things, it still doesn't guarantee that I'm going to bring that extroverted side or that it's going to necessarily be a good class. It's just about finding strategies that increase our odds of being the right version of ourselves at the right time for the right goal.
This makes me think a little bit of job demand resource theory. And in that, especially, we're having this conversation, the context of it is meaningful work. I want to do meaningful work. That meaningful work might create demands for me. It might actually draw down some of some of the battery levels, and I might get thrust in situations that might be complex, that might put me into situations that are not the things that are just natural and easy and essential for me. And so it sounds like the things that you're talking about are the resources that I can bring to the table. I can think more deliberately about my body as a container, about what kind of levels of energy I'm going to bring, about who is going to be in the room to give me more resources to meet the demands to be able to do the thing that I think is important.
Yes. And so then one way that understanding your personality traits can help in the workplace from a sort of self-management perspective would be to say, understanding that anytime you're doing a task that requires you to act counter dispositionally, then often, not always, but often that's going to place more demands on you. And so
Mm.
then you need to think about resource management, either proactively or also retrospectively. So if you find yourself tired at the end of a work, day or of a particular meeting, you might reflect back on, well, is that partly because I had to like put in this effort to bring out a certain version of myself for those tasks in order to perform them well. But I now need to find what Brian Little, personality psychologist, calls a restorative niche, right? So how do I find the moments to bring me back to that? And one of the things I do with my MBA students sometimes is I ask them to brainstorm a list of things that would help them restore their resources if they had 2 minutes, 2 hours, 2 days, or 2 weeks, right? And so that's corresponds to the amount of time you often have between meetings, right? 2 minutes. What can you do to buy yourself a little bit of resource in that window? Don't check your email, right? It's like, and they brainstorm lists. Like they're like, okay, well, some of them it's like take deep breaths. Some of them it's like listen to a quick song, or do 10 push-ups, or a range of different things people come up with for that like 2 minutes. Just look out the window instead of at your narrow screen. These little restorative niches that say, okay, before I go into the next call, I'm going to take a moment, give myself some resources back, and that's going to help me come into that. And then, okay, well, what if you get a long lunch break? Or what if you have autonomy of your schedule and you can work in sort of bursts and then give yourself a longer break? What could you do with that amount of time? 2 days is the weekend, right? And then 2 weeks would be a long, long vacation. So I think I encourage everybody to come up with a menu for yourself. And there will be some common ones that lots of people will have on their lists, but also there'll be ones that are just very idiosyncratic to you. Those little things that give you back that bit of resource that can help you, again, show up at the next thing with the right version of you. Because it comes back to this idea, we all have these different versions of ourselves within us. We could just let situations in the environment bounce us around so that we don't necessarily have control over which aspects of ourselves are coming out when, versus trying to reclaim a little bit of that agency to say, okay, what can I do to increase the odds that the better versions of me, or just the more appropriate versions of me, come out at different times?
Hey there. If you're one of our listeners who usually fast forwards through my intro spiel to get to the good stuff, I thought I'd catch you up here instead. Here's something I'm really excited about. We're launching the Meaningful Work Pod Club. Look, I've read so many of your messages about how you're trying to create more meaningful workplaces, and I keep hearing the same thing. You want to connect with like-minded professionals who are wrestling with these same challenges. Well, that's exactly why we're creating this space. On February 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're hosting our very first virtual session. Now, this isn't another passive webinar. It's a chance to engage with other professionals who are just as passionate about meaningful work as you are. We'll take the ideas directly from our episodes and we'll work together to figure out how to actually implement them in the real world. Space is limited for this pilot session, and I'd love to have you join us. Just head over to eubd.ca/podclub. That's eubd.ca/podclub to save your spot. I'll be there, and I'm looking forward to having the kind of rich discussions we can't fit into a podcast episode. Now, back to our conversation. Now, you said that you wanted to return to the topic of sincerity, and I'm really curious about sincerity. I'm curious about sincerity also because when I hear the word sincere, I think about congruence, which is one of the key pillars that Mike Steger would say is part of meaning. And I've seen in the context of so many of these conversations of meaningful work this idea of congruence. We say we want to do something, but then the reality kind of descends upon us, or our organization says we want to do something, we wind up doing something different. Sincerity feels kind of like that at the very core individual level. Like it's a say do get at the interior level of personality almost.
Yeah. So one thing I've looked at empirically is authenticity, right? So we looked at, do people who generally report that they're more authentic individuals, they report high levels of authenticity. Do they have different profiles of which aspects of themselves that they want to bring out? And in particular, the hypothesis might be, right, if authenticity is about being true to yourself, then we would expect that people who say they're more authentic will want to express personality characteristics that correspond more closely with their typical personality traits. So if I say I'm an extrovert in general, well, then in order to be authentic, the implication is, well, then I should want to be extroverted more of the time. Right. If I say I'm an introvert, then I should want to be introverted more of the time because that is being true to myself, so to speak. But that's not what we find, right? So we find that authenticity is just generally associated with wanting to express pleasurable states. So people who report high authenticity, right, generally want to be more extroverted. They generally want to be more agreeable or more open, even if they are more dispositionally introverted or
Hmm.
disagreeable. I think there's a question about, well, what is authenticity? Like, which version of ourselves are we being true to? And I think this is where authenticity becomes a box that we put ourselves in and that other people put us in. Because if we expect people to be authentic all the time, but then if we pair that with an assumption that somebody is only just one kind of person, then that restricts somebody's degrees of freedom for all the different ways that they could behave or experience the world. And so um, I wonder for you, when you were sort of going through that list of personality characteristics that describe you, Andrew, are there any aspects of yourself that ever feel like they're both true to you, but they're in some degree of tension?
Certainly one aspect of I talked about kind of, kindness or humility, which I think is true. And and it's interesting that those were the things that come out. I think that the tension is also that I deeply value critical thinking and judgment. And I get to be very snobby and annoying about all of those things. And I kind of I love that. If you ask my partner Paolo about what I'm actually like, I think he'd veer much more towards the not kind and humble versions of me. So it's just interesting, even that like when I talk about myself, I use the more desirable versions of those things rather than the like less desirable possible, or at least the ways that I interpret those things as less desirable, and I don't mention them.
Yeah. So if you think then about how that shows up in your work, right? So I think the question is, are there times where you're judgmental and critical that are sincere? And are there times where you're kind and compassionate and reserving judgment that are also sincere?
Yeah.
Same or different patterns of behavior, but same level of sincerity or authenticity felt on your part. But us as outsiders, we don't necessarily understand that. So if we see a general pattern where the version of Andrew that we see most of the time is the kind, compassionate, not very critical because you're focused on supporting people, then if we then see you do something judgmental and quite critical of somebody, we may feel that that is inauthentic. But they could be motivated by the same value or motivated by those different behaviors could be motivated by the same value or the same goal. And so this is where, again, I think we need to find ways to allow space for people to express different aspects of themselves at different times, including at work. And I think, you know, we hear the phrase "bring your whole self to work" a lot when you hear organizations talk about inclusion and belonging, and it's one of the things they do to try to improve employee experience. But what does that actually mean? Does that mean bring all the different sides of you to work? Does that mean don't hide aspects of your identity that you feel like are different? I think that's where we run in. A lot of people run into minefields, and John Amaechi, an organizational psychologist, talks about this, where this is particularly a risk for minorities or underrepresented groups, where the message is bring your whole self to work. But then if you actually do that in a way that other people don't know necessarily how to interpret safely or appropriately, or they don't necessarily understand, then it creates a real risk for people for whom some aspect of their self, whether that's connected to their identity, their personality, their interests, it's a risk, right? You're inviting people into a risk. And unless you're actually prepared to accept those contradictions in people and the fact that they may have these multiple aspects of who they are, then you're setting people up for a potentially quite tricky situation at work.
So what do we do? Like, I mean, if how would you take any of this and kind of applied in the context of work, especially in the context of, let's say, an EDI conversation, or in the context of helping someone kind of figure out what authenticity or sincerity might mean for them in the workplace, in an attempt to probably help them find more meaning at work, or to say that that's important. Like, what would any of this actually yield from a, yeah, pragmatic sense?
So I think from a practical sense, so one area where you might think about this is career decisions, right? So lots of people take personality assessments to try to figure out what's the right career for me. And there is some research that shows that when you use the right personality assessment that sort of assess people's interests or their profiles, you can get some general patterns of, right? People with this trait are more likely to be successful or more likely to be happy in this career or another. But it's very broad brushstrokes kind of research, right? So it doesn't give you a high degree of accuracy. But just because in general, people who are extroverted, right, to some extent tend to do better in sales. You can't be too extroverted, right? So the most successful salespeople are the ones who are sort of in the middle a little bit. But let's say you find out that research, does that actually apply to you? Well, I think the question I would encourage you to then ask would be to say, okay, well, what are the factors that bring out your extroversion, right? What are the conditions that make it easy for you to be that version of yourself? And are those conditions present in that kind of job role? Are those conditions present in this particular organization? Are those conditions present in this industry? So you could ask about, what are the default set of conditions I'm going to be working in if I go into this line of work? And what are the kinds of personality traits that those conditions tend to bring out in me? And is that the version of me that I really want to have showing up at work? So it's a little bit less about just saying, well, what kinds of jobs are better for what kinds of personalities, and more about saying, whether it's about the job, the particular company, or the industry, to say, what are the default working conditions like? And does that bring out parts of me that I want to bring out more? Or does that tend to bring out parts of me that I want to bring out less? And if it's the latter, well, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily go into that line of work. The question would be, do you feel like you have sufficient strategies in place to avoid becoming a version of you that you don't want to become? Because I think that's where you end up in sort of the poor job fit. So that's sort of like one application, is just thinking about jobs or potential employers or potential industries to say, okay, which versions of me do I think this is likely to bring out? And are those the versions of me that I want to bring out more of or less of?
Mhm.
At least that way you're not surprised if you find yourself becoming a person that is different than what you intended to be, because you've thought about it a little bit in advance. Um, then there's just like a sort of self-management, right? So we talked a little bit about the resources and those kinds of things. So one of the things I study a lot is burnout. And so thinking about how to actually sustain yourself over time requires thinking about how to move fluidly, right, between these different states, and knowing that when your demands are pulling on you to keep pushing yourself in these different directions that don't necessarily come as naturally to you, what are you going to do to restore your resources? Because if you just keep going for too long in that way, that's when the costs are likely to increase. And then I think there's a bunch of, implications and questions around management and leadership, right? So how do
Yeah, I was going
you
to specifically ask about that. But like, what does this mean as managers of people that we should be doing with our direct reports?
Well, so one is, right, so your role as a manager requires you to engage in different kinds of tasks, right? So burnout rates are higher among managers than they are among individual contributors,
Mm.
typically. And they're especially high among sort of middle managers, right? So if you're a low level or mid level manager where you've got some direct reports, sometimes a lot of direct reports, but you don't necessarily have the real sort of resource control and power that you have at sort of director or above levels within organizations, where you start to get more ability to protect your time and create boundaries. If you're in that middle level, you're often in this double bind where you're expected to support the performance of all the people on your team and to manage their experience, but also to be responsible for your own work tasks. You're now being asked to contribute to more strategic conversations and things like that. And so that requires you to move back and forth between more different ways of working, right? So you have to go from having a difficult one-on-one with your direct report to then having, deep thinking time about a sort of key strategic question to then going to a board, not necessarily a board meeting at that level, but sort of to like a general management team that's cross-functional, talking to a whole bunch of different managers. There's 12 people in the room and there's a lot of different voices and opinions coming on. So you're switching back and forth between a lot more different modes of working. And frankly, managers are not given the resources or the tools or the tips to prepare them to do all that switching, right? So, especially if you've been promoted to that manager role because of your initial individual contributor performance. So, a very common experience is somebody does well as, say, a software engineer, or they do well in a customer service role. They do well in as an individual salesperson or something like that. And so then an opening comes up to manage a team of people who do the same kind of work. And so we promote you based on your individual performance. But this is really going to change the design of your job, right? And in changing the design of your job, we're going to change the demands on which versions of you need to bring out on a regular basis, but we're not necessarily going to equip you to do that. So I think one implication for managers is for self-management, right? You need to get better at switching between these different modes. And maybe that's using the Paul Graham idea of maker days and manager days, right?
What's that?
So it's the idea of basically chunking out your time to have days that are sort of, or blocks of time that are set aside for making, which is sort of deep intellectual or strategic work. This is where you're trying to generate new ideas or new content or new products or whatever line of work you're in. You're doing the creative strategic work, whereas manager days are both literally people management, but also sort of task management. You're responding to the stuff that has come up that needs some help. And so you're creating separate blocks of time, recognizing that they require different versions of you. There's advantages to that, right? Being able to chunk out your time in that way, because you can think more strategically about, well, what's the right place? So I think about hybrid work, right? Do you want to be, if it's a maker day, right? You want to work on the strategic creative tasks. Is it better to be in the office or is it better to be at home? And I don't think we actually know a general answer to that question because it can often be highly individualized, right? So I think I found in talking to a bunch of managers that some of them, when they want to do that work, they need to get out of their home environment. They need to go into an office as long as they can have private space within the office. So if they're sitting in an open office floor plan and lots of people are bugging them with questions, doesn't work so well.
Mm-hmm.
But get out of their home, go to an office. There's at least a semi-private space where they can put on noise canceling headphones. They get the stimulation of being out in a different environment and in a different headspace.
Change geography, different geography. Yeah, exactly.
Whereas other people, like for those days, they really want to be home, right? That actually reducing the mental load of having to commute, deal with all this external stimuli allows them to go deeper in their thinking and that kind of work. So that's where when a company can figure out how to offer flexibility to employees, that creates the space for them to choose their environment based on what their tasks are for that day.
This is an incredible kind of eye-opening conversation for me in terms of thinking about the complexity of the individual and just recognizing how much control we have over things that we don't actually necessarily think that we have control over in the context of our daily basis and our daily activities and those resources that we can bring to bear towards all these different kind of sides of our personality and what we need in a specific moment.
That connects something I wanted to just ask you about briefly. So in research, just to get nerdy for a second, we've been nerdy for more than a second, but we sometimes talk about the difference between variable-centered approaches to psychology and person-centered approaches. So most psychology research that often gets talked about, right, on a podcast like this is variable-centered, right? And so, I mean, the fact that it's called the Meaningful Work Matters podcast, right, that is, the focus is on the variable of meaning and meaningfulness. And a lot of research on meaning and meaningfulness is done by focusing on, well, what drives that particular variable in the way that we've measured it. Whereas person-centered approaches to psychology tend to sort of look more holistically at individuals and their overall experience and recognizing more of the idiosyncrasies that may be unique to understanding them versus to understanding this construct. And so I guess the question, we're often asking is, are we interested in understanding meaning at work as a phenomenon? And that's where we'll tend to sort of focus on the variable centered approach. Or are we trying to understand this person and what they'll find meaningful in their work? And that's more of a person-centered approach. And you've mentioned a bunch of times, right, that what's the phrase that you often use? Like what works for one person works for one person. I can't remember
One
the
size
exact.
fits none.
Yeah,
One
one
size
size
fits
fits
none.
none. So I wanted to ask you to say more about that because I've heard you say it a bunch of times recently. And what you mean by that.
Hmm. I think it is exactly what you're describing in my language, or at least in the way in which I think about any of this, and my observations, and in the more research that I've done. It's a recognition that meaning is truly in the eyes of the beholder, and I find this deeply conflicting. Like I have conflicting thoughts about this particular idea. But let's use kind of, Pratt and Ashworth's definition of meaningful work, which is work that is personally significant and worthwhile, which means for you. I mean, so that recognizing the fact that what is going to be meaningful for you is going to be different than what is meaningful for me. Michael Pratt talks about all of these different ways in which we can find meaning in different kind of slices of our experience of work, whether it's about the utility of my job to have a life outside of work, or the status that I get, or the kinship that I have with other people, or the service that I'm providing, or the mastery that I'm feeling. So, kind of in those kind of different spheres. Or if you look through the lens of self-determination theory, it might be, is there a sense of relatedness, or is there a sense of autonomy that's really important in this particular situation? But it becomes very situational, and what the ingredients are that's going to make work meaningful for you are inherently going to be different than the things that are going to make work meaningful for me. And we also work in organizations where our goal is to try to find what is going to make the most meaning for the most people in a given context, allow us to pursue common goals with shared interests, and not just unique and individualized missions. So somehow we have to reconcile this challenge of recognizing that we're all different. We're all going to find meaning in different and unique ways. And we all have to find ways to row together so that we can accomplish goals that are bigger than any one of us.
I love that. It reminds me of there's a quote, I'm forgetting the psychologist who originally said it, but I heard it through Brian Little, where he says, these original psychologists said that each of us is in some ways like all other people, like some other people, and like no other person. And personality psychology is interested in sort of all of those. But I think about that from a meaning perspective at work, right? So there are probably some things that are fairly universal across all humans in terms of the things that tend to create meaningful work experiences. Then there will be a set of things that will be meaningful for many people in group A, but not necessarily for people in group B. And there will be other things that are really meaningful for people in group B, but not as much for people in group A. So there's some things that sort of are common among subgroups, right? And we don't necessarily know what all those subgroups are. And then there will be the things that are really the things that you find meaningful that no other person or very few other people, right? But it's a particular thing that is meaningful because I think often those things are because they have some kind of personal history. So you had Patrick Hill on,
Hmm.
and things that he studies is derailment, right? And he talks about the importance of people perceiving some sense of continuity across their lifespan, right? And so when we feel a disconnect, that can leave us feeling derailed, right, or adrift. But when we have these little moments where something reminds us of an early work experience or a past work experience. I was actually just talking to been working on this conference that you're involved with as well, and we've been having to deal with lots of spreadsheets. And it's been lots of spreadsheet management, trying to do filtering and sorting and things like that. And my very first internship before I finished college, like my first professional internship with a major company, I worked for Macy's, the department store chain in New York. And I worked in the buying department of all places. So helping them with trying to sort of choose clothes to put in the men's activewear department. But a big part of that job is spreadsheet work, right? So I spent that summer in New York, hovered over a computer looking at Excel and learning about all different ways to sort data in Excel. And one of my colleagues, who is not an Excel pro, but is a very accomplished researcher and is skilled at so many other kinds of technical software and data manipulation, just Excel is on her thing. And so I had this moment over the past couple of weeks where I got to use these skills that I developed in an internship 20 odd years ago, that is, long ago in my work history. And I was telling this story about, oh, like the reason I know how to do these things is because of this random work experience I had 20 years ago. And it was really meaningful for me to draw that connection between past me and present me. It's just a me story, right? Like, I mean, there might be pieces of that will resonate for other people, but it was very idiosyncratic in terms of what made that moment meaningful for me was just about my personal history. And so I think, to your point about one size fits none, right? I think I get the spirit of that phrase, but I caution because I do think that there are these, it implies that there are not these commonalities, right? And I think there are these commonalities that suggest that like these kinds of experiences or activities are going to increase meaning for many people, but not necessarily for everybody. But then we have these really idiosyncratic, ideographic experiences that are just about, that was really meaningful for me. And I think those are the hardest to create on purpose. Yeah, I don't know.
I love that. That's great. And this is where we are going to pause in terms of this episode, because there's so much more that I want to talk to you about, Reb. We haven't even gotten into two of the most kind of fascinating topics that I know that you spent a lot of time thinking about. One is generosity, and the other is collaboration. So we're going to have a part two of this episode. Thank you very much, Reb.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.